Hey everyone, so we are going to do some interpretive videos that detail aspects of construction of garments that we have underway. So, being that year to come, we are focusing on the year 1774 and the 26th Regiment of Foot as the garrison. A lot of my work this winter has been the production of British military coats. And this series of videos is going to look at different aspects of construction as I am sort of going through the process. And right now I'm at the process of putting lapels on a couple coats, and thus you guys get to learn about how to lay out the lace appropriately. Now, when it comes to laying out the lace, generally it seems that we have about a 2 to 2.5 inch distance, not between the lace loops, but between the buttons, the buttonholes. And that's really the important thing to remember, that these lace loops are really providing structure for the button, not necessarily specifically is the lace loop the integral part of what's going on here. So the fact that they are about 2 to 2.5 inches apart is based on the original garments, generally speaking, the officer's clothing that does survive. And then the number of lace loops and consequently buttons on a lapel is going to be wholly dictated by the size of the coat. So a taller coat is going to have more buttons. The reason being is that if you began to space out the buttons on a longer lapel, you're going to find that they're going to be further apart. And that is not going to be uniform when the company, or say the whole battalion, is formed at review, because you're going to see the definite distance between. And so for a longer torsoed man, you're going to want a longer lapel. And that's going to mean you're going to want, of course, say 11 lace loops, opposed to the typical 10 that you see on military garments. And standing orders and other such written descriptions of those military uniforms. So, let's begin. All right, so these are the tools that are ideal for laying a lace out on lapels. Don't need all of these, but I would recommend that you at least get the bare bones. So obviously, needle and thread are going to be critical for this. I'd recommend a needle that is not relatively large, but actually small, so that it will slide through the warp and the weft of the relatively heavy cloth that you're probably using. In the same vein, good stout linen thread is also pretty important. If you use good quality materials, you're going to have a lot less ache and pain when it comes to the production of your clothing. So with needle and thread, of course, beeswax used to wax that thread, which is an essential part of sewing, hand sewing with, of course, linen thread. So some of the other tools, of course, kind of more of a modern context, but large pins with these large heads are really convenient, especially if you just cut your fingernails, because they're easy to pick up. But they're also long enough that you can lay out lace with some ease. It's not essential. You could do it with just basting, which we'll go over later. But pins and a magnetic pin cushion has certainly made my life easier. Albeit that with magnetic pin cushion, everything becomes magnetized. So you just have to get used to that. Different size scissors will make your life easier. You don't need a pair of shears to cut thread. So get yourself snips and shears. You're going to want chalk to ensure that as you lay out your lace, you have a guide. Make sure your chalk is good tailor's chalk, because some of the stuff that is on the market can leave kind of this waxy residue, which when you iron it, it will kind of stain the garment. Not indefinitely, but it will definitely be noticeable for some time. If you don't have a chisel and then a cutting board, stop watching this video and go get yourself a chisel. This is an inch. I recommend getting not only an inch, but an 1.25 and an 1.5 inches. These tools are essential when it comes to 18th century tailoring. Scissors simply won't cut it. So when it comes to doing your buttonholes, get a chisel. In the same vein, your cutting surface ideally should not dull your chisel. So what that means is you don't want a wood cutting board, if you will. This is a piece of sole leather. Silicon pad would work just well, but for the maintenance of your tools, don't use a wooden cutting board. Final set of tools, quilting boards. Again, not necessary. You can find similar shaped things, whether that be paper note cards or books, which will give you the right angles that you need, but the fact that these are transparent makes laying out that lace a ton easier. And if you get a wide one and then also a relatively long one, you're able to tackle pretty much all of the challenges when it comes to laying out lace loops. So I'd highly recommend investing in a pair of these if you have not already. So our first step is going to be constructing the lapel itself, which is very, very straightforward. In essence, the under lapel, which refers to the strip of red here that's going to actually be sewn to the garment, you want to cut this at that 3 inches to correspond with the clothing warrant. In some cases, I actually cut it 1/8 of an inch less than 3, because when you end up folding over the outer lapel, you end up gaining about 1/4 of an inch, which can make it look a little bit wider. That might be a little too picky, but in some cases I do cut it a smidge narrower. You're also going to want to make sure that when you are space back stitching your lapel together, you actually don't start all the way here on the edge. The reason being is that this edge has to be sewn to the front of the coat, and if you've sewn it all the way down to the facing cloth, well, you're not going to be able to do that as easily. So I recommend you give yourself a good 1/2 inch, almost 3/4 of an inch, because in many cases, making it easier for yourself to sew is going to make things a lot faster in the long run. Now, the first step to actually laying out these lace loops is very important for the overall look. And when we say lace loops, we could also do buttonholes in the same fashion. In that your lace loops or your buttonholes are supposed to be parallel with your waistline, and the bottom of the lapel should be parallel with that waistline. So if you use the bottom of your lapel as a guide, you should be able to set yourself up so that your lace or your buttonholes are laying out as they should on your coat. So what I do in many cases is just lay out a couple chalk lines to use as a guide as I'm setting the lace appropriately. And there doesn't have to be any sort of rhyme or reason to it. It's just a general guide to ensure that your lace is staying parallel with the bottom of your lapel. So once you got those parallel lines marked out, the next step would be to lay on your lace loops to correspond with those lines. So as sort of modern tradesmen, I think there's a tendency to rely on devices of measure, whether that's your measuring tape or your quilting ruler, to ensure a degree of accuracy. And in this time period, you really don't need that same degree of accuracy. For the reason that the human eye can do it basically well enough. And as soon as you start putting measurements and numbers and trying to divide this evenly up, in essence, you could have taken considerably less time to just eyeball where you want all of these different lace loops to go. And if you look at the original garments, you're going to see a slight variation between, say, the distances of buttonholes or lace loops, indicating that they're just doing the same thing. So make it easier on yourself and just rely on your line of sight in order to lay out those loops. You can go back and double check yourself if you want, but you're actually going to save a lot of time if you just use your mind's eye. There's also the fact, too, that tradesmen, we develop the ability to estimate distances very, very accurately. So I might be barking up the wrong tree when saying you should just use your eye, but I would encourage that you try to do so. All right, that looks good enough for me. So as you begin to baste your lace loops in place, it's important that you take into account that it's at this point where your lace loops begin to take that proper rectangular shape. And the way you do that is going to be with your basting stitches. So as you stitch along, make sure that you are basting those rectangles straight, and that of course you're going to be parallel with the other ones. When I'm at this point, I don't even bother securing the thread. I use too much wax, as many of you may know, but that extra wax is actually keeping that thread in place. Imagine, after all of these have been sewn down, I have to go and take out all of those basting stitches. And it's going to be a lot easier if I can just zip them up, opposed to having to take out what would, in essence, be 20 large stitches in place for these 10 lace loops. So you probably are laughing about how I'm counting the seconds and half seconds, and I'm aware it sounds ridiculous, but it's amazing how quickly a project like this can turn into a 30, 40-hour project, especially if you've never built one before. And it's really this second shaving here and there, which in the long run is actually going to dramatically reduce your time, especially as you build your second one, or your 40th or 50th one, or whatever it is at this point that I have sewn. So use your thumbs. You can slide that lace loop around, ensuring that you're getting that proper rectangular shape. And then, as you go on to the next lace loop, don't bother cutting that thread, because that's seconds of you picking up and putting down your scissors, and all you really need to do is go like so. Now make sure you don't pull it too much, because if you do that, ultimately you're going to be bringing those lace loops closer together, and what that's going to do is make this less parallel. So often, instead of doing it on the top, get your rhythm of stitching into the motion of actually having those larger stitches on the bottom. And in that way, they're not going to distort your lace loops. So now time to stitch down all of the lace loops. The best way to hand sew is to ensure that the hand that is going to be gripping the material is directly underneath where you are sewing, so that you have maximum control over what you're doing. So in the context of, say, building the coat, when you got a lot of the pieces together, if you spend 30 seconds trying to wiggle your hand into a certain area to sew near there, you're actually going to be saving yourself some time. So even though it's quite evident that all you need to do is grasp the underside of the lapel like so in order to hold it securely in place, it is pretty essential that you are maintaining a strong grip and on both sides of what you're sewing to ensure the accuracy of your stitches overall. So with that in mind, easy to grasp the lapel like so. I typically start at said corner and then work my way around the outside. And this way you can ensure that your rectangle is going to be a rectangle, because if you start on the inside, you may sort of mess that up a little bit. So I just do stitch in place right underneath that corner. And speaking of stitches, you can use a whole bunch of different stitches in order to sew these down. If you look at the original garments, or if you look through the lace book, especially if you've got high resolution images, you can see a myriad of stitches employed in order to sew lace loops down. And lace loops are really a small category of just sewing lace down, in which case you use, again, a myriad of stitches. So if you're just using one stitch, you're probably not going to be producing the best loops. I would employ a myriad of stitches. So for example, in the course of doing a lace loop, I use a running stitch, I use a spaced back stitch. In some cases, there's a fell stitch, say in order to ensure that, say, any frays are being tucked in. In some cases, it's just stitched. You know, you're just putting needle and thread through cloth in order to keep it secure and in place and neat. So don't limit yourself to one stitch, because that's not what the originals look like, and that's a pretty inefficient way of trying to sew these down. So, stitch away. So I got my first stitch through here, probably just, you know, stick the needle into lace loop in order to cover over that little fray there, and then continue with a running stitch. Now, for the sake of the camera, my hand movement is a little bit restricted, otherwise I'll end up bumping the stand here. But you want to make sure that you are doing nice, quick stitches as you go along. The reason being is that when you have finally sewn all of your lace down on a garment like this, so that's both lapels, that's cuffs, pocket flaps, the 4 loops at the center back seam, and then the 2 on the collar, you're actually halfway done with the garment. So you don't want to be laboriously stitching these loops in place. So that means making sure that your thread is the correct length. A longer thread is going to mean that your stitch takes longer. Shorter threads mean you can do a lot faster stitches. And you want to make sure you're not over sewing it, right? You don't want a million stitches in these things. You want just enough to keep it in place and to stay in place. You don't want a zillion stitches because that's going to take way too long. So now I have completed the top of the triangle right here. I just did a running stitch right there, just tacking it down. And I'll probably do a running stitch all the way around the outside as well. So when you are doing said running stitch, you want to make sure that the stitch on the outside is as small as it is on the bottom. The reason being is that when you go to unbutton the lapels of your coat to button it across the breast, you're going to see all of those little stitches, as you can see here. So that's where we're at. That's within the range of acceptability. That's looking a little bit big. These are looking a little bit big. Again, I am less than a foot away from this, so I can see in detail, in depth, all of my stitches, where when I think Kevin goes to wear this and he unbuttons his lapels, as he is bound to do, no one's going to really see it. So, you know, don't overdo it, but you want to make sure, ideally, that you have those small stitches on both sides. You also want to make sure, and we're getting a little sloppy here, that as you are stitching it down, that you're still maintaining a generally parallel correlation to your other loops. Now, as we get to the other side, something changes a little bit. Now, when it comes to the size of these lace loops, often what happens is the way that they are positioned on the lapel and their size means that you would be completely stitching the under lapel down to the facing material. And what that means is that you won't have the flap that you need to sew to the outside edge of the coat available. So to remedy this, what I end up doing, and you can do it whichever way you want, I don't particularly care, but what I do is, in essence, just put my hand between the facing and the under lapel, just a finger, and in that way you're stopping the needle from going through all layers. Now, what you could do is, you know, sew it down completely to the under lapel, and you can still stitch that under lapel down to the front of the coat, but in that method, it's going to be a lot more time, and you're going to be sewing with the body of the coat in your lap and the lapel on the other side, which sounds difficult to do. So I save myself the pain, and ultimately I'm saving time by simply not stitching down the end of the lace loop in order to make sure that I can set that lapel quickly and efficiently when the time comes. So again, little running stitch here. You want to make sure, and you can kind of see it beginning to happen, that as you are sewing, you're not putting tons and tons of tension on your thread. The reason being is that when you do that, you're going to be constricting the loop, and you're going to get sort of oval shapes opposed to those nice crisp edges. If you do begin to go a little oval, sometimes I just do a slight whip stitch to pull it back out. But again, it doesn't particularly matter because no one's really going to notice when it's 5 feet away. So the top has been stitched. We have those stitches just going through the yellow cloth, giving us enough room in the future in order to set the lapel. Now down to the other side. Now, I am currently sewing in the basement because it is too stupid hot upstairs and obviously too hot outside. You will find as you sew along that you may be slowed by the fact that there is grease, say from what you've been eating or from the heat and humidity outside on your hands. So if you find yourself slowing down, definitely take the time to wash your hands. Get rid of that grease because that is going to seriously slow down your stitches. Another thing you can do is take your wax and actually rub some of that wax off the surface and then onto your hands, giving them slightly tacky texture, which is going to be a lot easier when it comes to sewing because your needle will be more secure to your hand. So we've got all of our outside done using that running stitch. Now it's time to get into the interior. When looking at the interior, I often sew down these little triangle guys first before moving on to the interior. And I just sort of stab, running stitch, whatever you want to call it. I would say it's just sewn. And to do so, in essence, needle goes, into lace loop, comes out on the other side. And because you're stitching through what would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a lot of layers of cloth because this thing has been folded, it can be difficult to get your needle to turn up into the cloth without leaving a big stitch on the bottom. So often I just do that stitch in 2 motions because it's going to be a little bit faster. It's going to be a little bit easier on the hands. So when that stitch happens, but you've got a lot of real estate to cover from point A, say, to point B, often what I do is sort of angle my needle in such a way that it shoots over to the other side. And then I place my needle directly or thereabouts to where that thread came out, and then manipulate it, pushing it up into the cloth so that I have those small stitches. So you got 1 stitch here, you got another stitch there, and then you guessed it, 1 down by the point. And that is typically enough to ensure that you have enough stitches on that part of the lace loop. You can do more if you want, not necessary. So now it is time to sew the interior. Woohoo. To do that, I actually use a space back stitch. The reason being is that the interior right here is actually going to get cut so that it can accept the button on the lapel. And you can get a lot more stitches per inch using a space back stitch than you can a running stitch when you're stitching through 3 layers of cloth right here. And it's important for there to be more stitches, or rather, I should say, enough stitches on the interior, because this is where all of the wear and the tear is really going to go into the lace loop. Because of the buttoning, the unbuttoning, the tension that is associated with that, and not to mention the presence of the shank of the button itself. So this part, you want to make sure it's sewn with sufficient stitches. Now, that doesn't mean you put a zillion stitches in it. I would just say maybe twice as many as what you've done at the top. So at the top here, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stitches. I'm definitely not doing 14 stitches here. However, I might shoot for 10. Now, you also want to make sure that when this gets cut, you are not cutting your own stitches. So that is going to mean that you are ensuring that you are going straight up and down and not at an angle. Because if you go at an angle, you run the risk of cutting your own stitches. Make sure you don't double up your thread like I just did, because that is a waste of materials, and it's also going to be slightly more challenging to sew. So make sure you always got that tail. All right, so now we approach the other end of our little triangle, or of our rectangle. That is a triangle. So here, same thing applies. I would stick my hand, my finger underneath, so that as I am stitching into my triangle, I am not, in essence, stitching the lace through all layers of the cloth, because it's going to be difficult to sew to the front of the garment. So same thing applies. You kind of want to make sure that as you're stitching, you're doing it in such a way that the thread doesn't have to travel as far underneath, because it's, you know, just a waste of thread, I guess. Although that might be a little too specific. But ultimately, it's easier if you go around in such a way that your final stitch is relatively close to your stitching, which will go on the other side of your lace loop. So, space back stitching once again. In some cases, if this was a non-functional lapel, simply being sewn down to the body of the garment, say with a false lapel, you could actually just do a whip stitch connecting the two sides together. But because this is going to be a functional lapel, you got to do that stitching along both sides. But it can shave a second here or there. So with the other side done, to secure it, all I really end up doing is slight space back stitch, just really going through that red cloth, one or two, and then they're done. And now you've got many more to go. All right, so now all of the lace has been sewn down. It's time to cut your buttonholes. Make sure you cut them now, opposed to sew the lapel to the front of the coat and realize that you had forgotten to cut them. It's not the end of the world, it's just a little more of a pain. So when you're looking at the size of the buttonhole that you're cutting, it's not actually the entire length of the interior of your lace loop, but really about 1.25 inches. What it really is going to be dictated by is going to be the size of your button, and specifically that shank. Because if you have a relatively thick shank like this guy here, what can happen is your lace loop will be forced open by the presence of that shank, making it look less rectangular. To ensure that this doesn't happen, make sure that you're cutting your buttonhole long enough, but based on the originals, they're not being cut from one end to the other, at least from what I've seen. So, take your chisel. I would highly recommend you go out and get yourself a chisel if you don't have one. This makes your life 100 times easier. So, get a chisel. So, anyway, and when you're cutting these, make sure that you are not cutting that lace, because then the whole thing will fall apart and it'll look kind of bad. So to ensure that you're getting a nice cut, what I often like to do is simply run the chisel down the interior of that lace loop, and it'll set down into that groove between the two textiles. What you can also do is sort of pull it back from either side to ensure that you're not cutting that lace. And then, ideally with just the force of your hands, pushing down onto the chisel should push it through the cloth without you relying on a mallet. Now, we're going to want about 1.25 inches, so extend that chisel out a smidge and cut again, and you're good to go. And then move on to the next one. So the final step of laying out the lace actually begins as you are starting to repeat what you've done on the other lapel. And that is ensuring that the top 4 lace loops are going to be matching the top 4 lace loops on the other side. The reason being is that Hook and I are going to be connecting this garment at the breast at lace loop or button at lace loop number 4, and then at number 1. And so you need to ideally ensure that they meet nicely for the sake of the symmetry of the garment. When you begin to get further down into the lower section of the lapel, it's not as necessary. The reason being is that as the lapel slopes away from the front of the wearer, there's a greater distance between the bottoms of the lapels than there is at the top. And therefore, you're not going to notice this same exactness. You want to, shoot for as good as you can with not wasting a bunch of time, but it's much more important to focus on the top than it is on the bottom. So with our lines drawn, as a general guide, we'll take our first 4 loops and lay them out. Ideally, what that means is that these points here are going to match up nicely when they're on the wearer. Sometimes, too, if you do mess this up, you can wiggle around where you set that hook and eye, which can move the lapel up and down when it is hooked. So if you set them slightly off, you can set it, maybe not quite so much like that, but like you can save yourself 1/3 of an inch at most if you find that you have messed up slightly. So with those top 4 set, we can then go ahead and set the bottom. One thing I would suggest about sewing garments that require your attention to this degree of detail is turn off Master and Commander or whatever sewing movie you have, and really just focus on what you're doing. I don't really get how people can watch TV and sew. Master and Commander is a great film that demands your whole attention and should not be the background of what you're doing. So turn on some music, listen to a podcast, listen to the news. Be focused on what you're doing, because ultimately, if you are able to rely on your eye to lay out things like lace loops and make sure that everything's rectangular, you can't be looking up and down every 10 seconds as you're watching Russell Crowe do his thing. And as said before, ensure too that you aren't over sewing it. These garments, they're not immaculately sewn when it comes to the quality that you would expect. And if you look at, say, the cost of altering a soldier's coat in the various standing orders of different regiments from this time, you'll see that they're not worth all that much money. So you really don't want to be over sewing these. But you also don't want to produce a garment that is poor in quality, because just in the time period, it would not pass an inspection. So you want to make sure that you are sewing to the point where you're putting enough stitches down that the lace will stay and it's not going to rip, but you're not over sewing it. And a lot of times, you can judge your stitches by the weight and thickness of the cloth. And this is what really will dictate how many stitches per inch you're able to do, especially with things like lace loops. So don't overdo it. Pay attention to what you're doing. Have fun. Make more than one, because the more you make, the lot easier it gets. And then, you'll begin to experience what it would be like to actually do this for a living. And then you'll find that those weird little perfectional quirks that you've had in the past really don't matter all that much. So, thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope this has been somewhat informative. Again, this is a way you can do it. I know there's a ton of different ways, so you don't have to do it this way, but that's how I do it. So, thanks very much, guys.